everybody, welcome to week 14 of public speaking. We'll be going over how to become a critical listener in this class session. So what we're going to go over today is the principles of critical listening, which we covered a couple weeks ago, but we're going to be focusing on it for this week. I'm going to play a short video that explains some of the principles of critical listening and give some tips from the video, and then we will talk a little bit about research preparation for Speech 3. So let's get started. So, becoming a skilled listener. First of all, we need to define critical listening. So in your textbook, critical listening is defined as listening with the goal of evaluating what is said in addition to listening actively for meaning and relevance. So this is different than listening just to appreciate something. So when we listen to music or watch a movie, we're really just listening to those things for our enjoyment. We're not evaluating the content of that song or that movie for, its argumentative structure or the evidence and the reasoning that they put forth in the message. We're just listening because we enjoy it. Now, critical listening is different. We are actually evaluating what the speaker says. Is what they're saying true? Do they have the evidence to back it up? And are the conclusions drawn valid? Are they logically sound? So it's a lot deeper than just listening to appreciate something. Critical listening involves assessing the quality of the claims, evidence, and conclusions made. So that's your claim data warrant. So are strong claims being made by the speaker? Do they have the appropriate evidence to support those claims? And then do the conclusions make sense? Sometimes a claim is strong, the evidence is there to back it up, but then the conclusion or what we should do with that information can fall apart. So assessing all three of those parts and making sure that they're all working in cohesion with one another to build a coherent, strong argument. That's what critical listening is all about. You also want to remain objective. So of course we all have our own personal biases and our feelings about these topics that you hear in a speech class, but you should still be objective in the way that you look at the way that the argument was constructed. So if the argument is logically sound and there is appropriate evidence to back it up, you should be able to still appreciate that good argument. And of course, you must ask why the information is true and how we could confirm that it is true. So you never want to take anything at face value that any speaker says. You always want to ask, how do you know that? And you should be able to pursue their evidence to verify that the claims that they are making are actually true. So making sure as a speaker that you are using quality evidence, and as a listener that you are assessing that evidence. Where did it come from? Is it quality? Or did the person who produced that evidence, do they have some sort of bias or slant? Is the evidence outdated? Or is it not presented in good faith? So you always want to track back to the source of that evidence and find out how we know what the speaker is saying to be true. How can we go back and confirm that it's actually true? Now, your book lists 5 different things that critical listeners should always do. Number 1 is to think about whether the speaker produced appropriate evidence to justify their claims. So I kind of already touched on that, but it's very important to remember, even as you are crafting your own speech, to be able to make a claim. Let's say I want to make a claim that we need to do something about gun violence in Milwaukee. So I would need to provide evidence that, 1, gun violence is a problem that is getting worse. So I might pull in some data to show that the issue of gun violence is getting worse, not better, in our city. So that's one piece of evidence, but I also need to show that it is damaging, that it's having an effect on us. So I might pull in some stories or examples or testimony from someone that illustrates the effect that this gun violence is having on our community. So both of those pieces of evidence would be necessary to really make the claim that we should do something about our gun violence. Because I've provided evidence that the issue is very prevalent, and I've also provided evidence that the issue is serious and having a detrimental impact on our community. So number 2, you want to ask yourself what the speaker is not saying and what topics or information the speaker is avoiding. Sometimes we learn a lot more about the speaker's motivations by what they're leaving out of the speech. So you can maybe think of this in terms of counter arguments. Is there a glaringly obvious counter argument that the speaker is leaving out or that they don't want to touch? That could mean that they're afraid to engage with that argument because it might derail their entire argument. So be on the lookout for any obvious topics or issues that a speaker is not willing to talk about. Number 3, as I've already mentioned, you should be able to appreciate a well-organized, logical argument. So every year in public speaking, I encounter tons of argumentative speeches from students that I don't agree with. But that's okay, because I can still appreciate that the claim, data, and warrants for all the arguments line up. It makes sense, it's logically coherent, and it doesn't go against my common sense. So I can still appreciate the work that put into making a logically sound argument, even if our values are a little bit different. And so that's sort of the task of a critical listener. You should be able to do the same. Number 4, you want to sort through relevant and irrelevant parts of a speech. So the most important parts of a persuasive speech would be the claims, the data, and the warrant that are presented, the overall argument that the speaker is trying to make. Some of the quote-unquote irrelevant parts of a speech might be things that are more stylistic. So some of the things that they do to grab attention or to connect the speech with the audience. Not to say that those things are not important, they definitely are. But you don't want to get hung up on one story or one example, because that is not the overall point that the speaker is trying to make. It's more so just supplementary. So pay attention to the most important parts of the speech, which are the arguments being made. And number 5, you want to assess the strong and weak points of a speech and offer constructive criticism. I've never had a speech before that is all bad or all good. Every single speech is going to have some good parts and some bad parts. Now, the ratio of good to bad might differ from speaker to speaker, but everyone should be able to pick out at least one good thing of any speech or any argument. And on the flip side, you should be able to point out any weak parts or flaws in somebody's argument. And that's an important part of learning how to think critically about somebody else's message. Now, I want to play this video for you because I think the woman who made this video explains some of these concepts very well and illustrates some good examples. So let's take a look at this.
What is critical listening and how it is being different from the usual listening? Critical listening means using careful, systematic thinking and reasoning to see whether a message makes sense in the light of a factual evidence. Critical listening can be learned with practice, but is not necessarily easy to do. Some people never learn this skill. Instead, they take every message at face value, even when those messages are in conflict with their knowledge. A good listener always displays respect for the speaker and are capable of providing quality feedback to others. Why is it critical listening is important? Being a critical listener comes down to using your critical thinking skills. These skills helps us in analyzing the speaker's message and motives to assess the message for authenticity and truth. There are 6 ways to improve your critical listening. Critical listening is first and foremost skill that can be learned and improved in exploring the 6 different techniques you can use to become a more critical listener. The first one is recognizing the difference between facts and opinions. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan is credited with saying, "Everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but they are not entitled to their own facts." Part of critical listening is learning to separate opinions from facts. And this works in 2 ways. Critical listeners are aware of whether a speaker is delivering a factual message or a message based on opinion. And they are also aware of the interplay between their own opinion and the facts as they listen to messages. The second one is uncovering assumptions. If something is factual, supporting evidence exists. However, we still need to be careful about what evidence does and does not mean. Assumptions are gaps in logical sequence that listeners possibly fill with their own ideas and opinions and may or may not be accurate. When listening to public speech, you may find yourself being asked to assume something is fact when in reality many people question that fact. The third one is to be open to new ideas. In the world of public speaking, we must be open to new ideas. Let's face it, people have a tendency to filter out information they disagree with, and to filter in information that supports what they already believe. The fourth one is to rely on reason and common sense. If you are listening to a speech and your common sense tells you that the messages is illogical, you are very well might be right. You should be thinking about whether the speech seems credible and coherent. In this way, you use your common sense can act as a warning system for you. If the message is inconsistent with the things you already know, if the argument is illogical, or if the language is exaggerated, you should investigate the issue before accepting or rejecting the message. Often, you will not be able to take this step during the presentation of the message. It may take a longer to collect enough knowledge to make that decision for yourself. The fifth one is to relate new ideas to old ones. As both a speaker and a listener, one of the most important things you can do is to understand the message and relate the new ideas to the old ones. If you can make effective comparisons while listening, it can deepen your understanding of the message. If you can provide those comparisons of your listeners, you can make it easier for them to give consideration to your ideas. The last one is taking notes. Note-taking is a skill that improves with practice. You already know that it's nearly impossible to write down everything a speaker says. In fact, in your attempt to record everything, you might fall behind and wish you had divided your attention differently between writing and listening. It's important to find a balance between listening well and taking good notes. Many people struggle with this balance for a long time. To increase your critical listening skills, continue developing your ability to identify the central issues in the messages so that you can take accurate notes that represent the meanings intended by the speaker. Listening ethically. Ethical listening rests heavily on honest intentions. We should extend to speakers the same respect we want to receive when it's our turn to speak. We should be facing the speaker with our eyes open. We shouldn't be checking our cell phones. We should avoid any behavior that belittles the speakers or the message. This excerpt expresses the decency with which people should treat each other. It doesn't mean we must accept everything we hear, but ethically, we should refrain from trivializing each other's concern. We have all that painful experience of being ignored or misunderstood. This is how we know that one of the greatest gifts one human can give to another is listening.
Okay, so I liked how she explained a lot of the principles that we talk about and that the book talks about, but she kind of frames them in a different way. So I pulled these tips from the video. So number one, recognizing the difference between fact and opinion. Now this one is huge. We need to be able to tell when a speaker is just giving their opinion and their perspective on things and when they're actually citing factual evidence. And being able to tease out those two can actually help you determine the soundness of an argument. Number two, you want to be able to uncover assumptions. So assumptions are sort of logical leaps from one step to the next. And the speaker is hoping that the audience will agree with all of their assumptions and not question them. But you should question all assumptions underlying within a person's argument. You should be able to tell that, well, you're making this glaringly obvious assumption here and basing all of your arguments and conclusions on it, but that assumption could be false. So try to uncover the speaker's underlying worldviews and their assumptions that they have when you're evaluating the arguments that they're making. Number three, as we've discussed, you want to remain open to new ideas. So you're going to encounter a lot of ideas in this class that you agree with, some that you don't agree with, some that might push the boundaries of what makes you feel comfortable, and that's okay. You always want to remain open to the possibility that those ideas might someday find a place in your life and in your worldview. The fourth one, rely on reason and common sense, or logos. So we know when something smells funny, when an argument isn't holding up. If it feels wrong, if something, if common sense tells you that this argument is not adding up, chances are something might be wrong with it. So in those moments where you naturally feel an inclination to resist that information or something's not making complete sense to you, that's a good opportunity to really dig into that part of the speech and figure out why it is that part is not making sense to you. Number 5 is comparing new ideas to old ones. So in order to assess the value of an argument or what someone is proposing as a solution, we need to be able to compare it to the status quo and the ideas that we already hold. So when you hold your ideas up to the speaker's ideas, how do they match up? How do they contrast or conflict one another? And that's one of the skills of critical listening, being able to evaluate new ideas in light of the old ones. And of course, number 6 is taking notes. That's sort of the general idea behind the peer evaluations that we do. So listening through a speaker's presentation and taking notes of the most important parts of the speech as they're going through it. And that will help you evaluate the message as well. So that's everything on critical listening, but let's take a quick look at the research process for Speech 3. So as of this week, I would be working on research because your outline is due next week. And then after that is when the speech is due. So in preparing for that, this is the order or the sequence of events that I would do if you haven't begun already. So step 1 is to find a nonprofit. So the nonprofit is sort of the star of the show in this speech. You need to find a nonprofit that aligns with your topic and also your worldviews. You want to find a nonprofit that you actually would support. So you look into their website and find out what problem do they help solve and how do they help solve it. Are they more of an advocacy group trying to change laws, or do they do more sort of boots on the ground type of work, like a soup kitchen would actually go out and feed real people in the community? And then there's organizations that do both. So look into what sort of work are they actually doing to solve this issue. Once you find a nonprofit, then step 2 is to dig around their website and find a couple potential calls to action. You want to find the call to action in the nonprofit first and then sort of work backwards in writing the speech. So I think it's easiest to do a problem solution speech for this third one. So you'll want to actually start with the solution, the call to action, and then work backwards. So what problem is that helping to solve? And construct your argument that way. So when finding your calls to action, you should look at the top of a lot of nonprofit websites will have buttons that say donate or get involved or take action. That's where you're going to find your call to action. So look at what sort of work do they do and how do they want people to get involved. You might find that your website has a ton of different options for getting involved, and that just means you need to narrow it down. As I've said before, I wouldn't pick more than 2 or 3 would kind of be pushing it for a call to action. And of course, you can't just stick with one call to action for the audience. You want them to go out and do this thing or this action that you are suggesting. So you want it to be reasonable and effective. So it has to be a simple call to action that people could actually go out and do. Then think about which calls to action would be the easiest to incorporate into a persuasive speech. So it's not really reasonable to ask people to set up their own marathon race. Everyone in the class is a college student and has a lot going on. So trying to find something that is easy to talk about, easy to defend, and easy to suggest that your audience go out and do. Then, number 4, you will start building the argument from there. So how will you convince your audience that this is the best call to action? What organization pattern might you use? As I said, you can do problem solution, but there are other options as well. Then what sort of evidence are you going to need to find to prove that this problem is serious and needs action right now and that your solution is actually going to help solve that problem? Then, where are the opportunities to evoke emotion and connect with the audience once you've structured your arguments? So you can kind of see that this speech, it is working backwards a little bit. You start by picking the nonprofit, then pick your call to action, and then construct your argument so that you are setting up a problem so that your call to action, your solution, perfectly takes down the problem and solves it. So that is all for this week. If anybody has any questions on finding a nonprofit or locking down that call to action, please let me know. I would have your call to action and nonprofit and all of that definitely solidified by the end of this week. And then really next week, making sure that your outline and your rough draft outline and the arguments are solid and ready for me to review them and give you the proper feedback. So that is all, and I hope everybody has a fantastic week. Bye.